Hello, good listeners, and welcome to another episode of Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, where we bring you stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dick. Earlier this year, I connected online with acclaimed novelist and writer David Bergen to talk about his book, Away from the Dead. David grew up in Niverville, Manitoba, and today crafts his prose from his home base in Winnipeg. He's written 14 books and received numerous awards and nominations for awards for his work. His father was a pastor, and his Mennonite upbringing is a frequent backdrop in his stories. Here's our conversation, which was recorded in January of 2026. Hello, David.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm fine.
David, we could talk about any one of your books, all of which I've read, but what I really want to talk about today is your book, Away from the Dead. It's a fictional story about the relationships between Mennonite and Ukrainian characters, much of it mediated through the eyes of Julius Lane, a Jewish bookseller. It's situated on a timeline roughly between 1900 and 1919. Now, a good number of your novels feature a Mennonite backdrop and characters, but I think this is your first book that one might think of as being at least adjacent to historical fiction. Where and how and why did Away from the Dead rank on your list of novels you wanted to write?
Very, very good question, Dan. I like your word adjacent to historical fiction because I don't really see it as historical fiction, and we can talk about that later. I didn't want to write this book, actually. I had no intention of writing this book. As a novelist, when you finish one book, you sort of set out to see, well, what am I going to write about? And in this case, I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I was capable of writing what would be termed historical fiction, going back in time. And then I started to do some reading, some research. I'm not sure what spurred me to do that. Maybe my father had been telling me stories. I was aware of growing up in Niverville at a Mennonite Brethren church, and every October there was a man who got up. His name was David Dick, and he would talk. It was our Sunday evening, and he would talk about the attacks by Nestor Machno and his gang and the anarchists. And I remember being, as a child, fascinated by this. I loved narrative, and he was very good at narrative, and he told wonderful stories. He always wept, and he only had, I think, two fingers on his right hand, and he would hold them up and as he talked, and I was fascinated by this.
As part of your research for this book, you visited the Mennonite Heritage Archives here in Winnipeg. What were you looking for, and what were you hoping to find?
I had no idea. I just knew that I didn't know where to start. I didn't have a lot of information for how people lived, and for even how an estate looked, or what kind of clothes people wore, or if there were Mennonites who had vehicles, if they just used horse and buggy, wagon, if they had threshing machines that were steam powered, all that stuff. I didn't know any of that. I was handed by the archivist librarian there a book by Peter J. Dick called Troubles and Triumphs, which was a series of journals written by him. He was a Mennonite who eventually left Ukraine, which was then Russia. But what I found in his journals was a richness of material that was exactly what I needed. He talked about livestock. He talked about money. He talked about what was taken from them as they left the border, finally, on their last stop. He talked about the boots they wore, the felt boots, the making boots. And boots became an important part of the novel itself. So his journals, his memoir, if we can call it that, I would call it journals, were essential to the writing. And I wouldn't have been able to write the novel without that book. And then also I was looking for information on the Selkschutz, the sort of the Mennonite army that was formed with the help of the Germans who were there at that time, and why they would do that, why they would take up arms. That interested me. They blamed Machno and his guns, but then they also took up guns, and they were a pacifist people, and that interested me. So that I found also in the archives. There was a lot. But the main one was Troubles and Triumphs by Peter J. Dick.
As a reader, novels invite me to explore my curiosities about people and relationships, places, and events through the eyes of someone else. Were there certain curiosities you wanted to explore in Away from the Dead?
Uh, um, I mean, my father was born in the Ukraine. My grandfather was a medic in the First World War. He refused to carry a gun. So I heard stories from my father, who obviously was too young to know them, but had them passed down to him. I didn't want to explore my family. I don't think that was what I wanted to do. I think I wanted to explore the reaction of Mennonites from whom I come and whose values I was raised with. And I wanted to explore how they behaved, how they managed, how they suffered, and how they left and decided to leave, which is a huge step. And so that to me was what interested me. And fiction for me is a manner of exploring doubt, questions, religion, God, all those things. But not in a didactic way. I'm not interested in that. Yeah.
You grew up listening to storyteller David Dick's revelations from the revolutionary era in Russia and Ukraine. Tell me a little about who he was and his connection to your novel.
Oh, he was simply a memory. I could describe how he looked. He was short. He had a crew cut. He was a very gentle man. I don't know what he was like when he was in Ukraine. I don't think he was a state owner. I think he was one of the poorer Mennonites, but I can't say for sure. I never really researched where he came from. But he was a very clear image in my head of someone who spoke of the past and spoke of it eloquently with a certain bias, obviously. I see that in hindsight, but with tremendous passion and a love for the place and a sadness for having to leave that place and for what happened during that time when I think now he probably was about 20 when he was at that age then. So, yeah, so it was simply very much an emotional response as a young boy watching him, and then a memory as an older man writing about it and thinking, well, he told me stories. I didn't use his stories, but I was aware of his stories. I think too that he was very good at telling stories that I loved. I loved as a young man, as a young boy, stories about war, and those are the novels I gravitated towards, which is really interesting. And he was telling me in church on Sunday evening in October stories of war and stories of brutality. And for some reason that fascinated me, and so that stuck with me.
Peter J. Dick's diary, Troubles and Triumphs, was one source for Away from the Dead. At times, his journal entries sing with just fascinating detail. A short entry in June 1915 says, "All pigeons were registered by police. They are looking for carrier pigeons." That detail, which I find to be such an incredible revelation, made it into your story. Are there other details that left you wide-eyed and didn't make it into your novel?
Yes, there are lots. There's only so much you can take from a from a journal and without making it forced. I do in my end notes at the end of the novel talk about Peter J. Dick's last paragraph, and that to me did not make it into the novel, but it made it into the end of the novel when I'm describing what I did use. And there's a line, I mean, they take all the crown property, he has that in quotes, such as ladders for climbing up into the car, basins, axes, saws, and pails were taken from us. So again, this is Peter J. Dick writing, and he's a bit of a poet. So again, and for the last time in Russia, we were robbed, just as we had been on the last night in Ladakop. It all seemed quite natural. That last line, it all seemed quite natural, is such a I think it tells you a lot about who Peter J. Dick was. That He was a realist, a bit of a perhaps a bit of a he accepted his fate, but he also made it out and so struggled for his fate.
The characters are forced into a lot of really hard decisions in response to events that are way beyond their control. What informed your considerations about human beings that have to make such tough decisions and how they rationalize their decisions?
Well, various characters make very different decisions. Sabline, for example, is the brother to Ina, and he was a fascinating character for me. He grew up as an orphan, was accepted by the Martins family to a certain extent, not like his sister was. Always sort of an outsider, not much of a talker, but could be explosive in his response to injustice towards people and animals, but also could be violent himself. And so he was a certain character that I thought, okay, he makes sense to me. And I don't want to explain him, but I have to trust that the reader will accept his behavior. And there are others. Well, Martin's is another one. He's the estate owner, perhaps almost dangerously close to stereotype in the sense that he rules the roost. And but I mean, we all know Mennonite men who ruled the roost. I could easily pick out character traits of him that in men that I was familiar with growing up in Niverville.
Speaking of Heinrich Martins, he learns that his 42-room mansion has been burned to the ground. Despite the ongoing turmoil, he decides he's going to rebuild it. I'm not sure what to call that. Arrogance, courageous resilience, outright hubris, maybe even hope? How did you arrive at that decision?
I think you hit it when you said hubris. I think a man like him, who has a 42-room mansion and has lots of workers that he does not pay well, is used to being in charge. And he can't believe that he would no longer be in charge. And to rebuild the mansion would be for him a symbol that he is still in charge, and he's gonna try doing it foolishly and impossibly. But that doesn't stop him from trying, or even thinking of trying, or having designs upon it, and which speaks to his, and I'll use your word again, his arrogance.
David, that wraps up all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for making the time to chat with me.
Yeah, well, thanks for being a reader, and I did not know you'd read all my books, so yeah.
That was a conversation I had with novelist David Bergen back in January of 2026. One of David's sources for his novel, Away from the Dead, was Peter J. Dick's memoir, Troubles and Triumphs, 1914 to 1924. You can find Dick's book, along with tons of related resources about that era, at the Mennonite Heritage Archives in Winnipeg. To hear this episode again, or share it with someone else, visit mharchives.ca and click on Radio. We love to hear from our listeners. Tell us what you're taking away from this show by sending a comment via email to info@mharchives.ca.
Hello, I'm Archivist Conrad Stace. The Mennonite Heritage Archives is a community-supported memory center that relies on donations from community members like you. To support this program and the preservation of Mennonite history, visit mharchives.ca and click on Support, or give us a call at 204-560-1998. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Church Canada, and Golden West Radio.
Next week, we'll bring you a story of hope and tragedy about a group of Mennonites who moved from Manitoba to Vanderhoof, British Columbia in 1918. Thanks to the Tales team of Conrad Stace and David Klippenstein, I invite you to visit Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives online at mharchives.ca, where you can find over 60 episodes of this show. Thanks for listening.